Then hit Los Angeles, the hills had been full of houses that were perched perilously on the steep Hollywood Hills landscape. This was dangerous enough given how frequently SoCal got rocked by earthquakes, but the nuclear blast had caused seismic activity so intense, most of the houses had slid down the hills and crashed into the streets below. This meant that climbing the lower portions of Mulholland was like trying to traverse a deadly obstacle course. Once we got to the upper portion of Mulholland, though, we had a different problem. Here, entire sections of the road had been washed away by landslides, so we often had to find a completely different way around. Eventually, though, we managed to get to the backside of Mulholland Drive where you could overlook the entire valley on a clear day. What we found made our hearts sink to the bottom of our chests. I'd been right about the enemy, whoever it was, targeting Bob Hope Airport. Because it was a federal emergency response location, you couldn't quite see the airport from our vantage point, but you could see the decimated ring of destruction that represented ground zero of an atomic blast. There was a similar ring over in the direction of Van Nuys, where another airport had once existed. In between the two rings of total annihilation was miles and miles of lesser but still overwhelming destruction. We set up camp as night fell so we could collect our thoughts. There'd be no help coming, it seemed. So our next course of action was clear. We had to get out of the city, but where to go? As we considered our options, we all heard a strange noise, something like the sky slowly tearing in two. Looking around us, we spotted two blinking lights far off in the distance, traveling south. That's when it hit us. It'd been so long since we heard any air traffic that we'd almost forgotten what a jet engine sounded like. It was impossible to tell what type of aircraft it was, but we knew where it was headed, and that was San Diego. Our spirits soared that night. And even Lucky must have felt it because he started happily barking along to our cheering. Someone had survived. The world hadn't ended after all. The attack was probably just on Los Angeles, maybe one or two other major cities, and a conventional war was still probably going on. But that's why there hadn't been an emergency response yet. The military was too busy. The rest of the US must still be humming along. That night, Alexis and I kissed for the first time. I guess the euphoria of knowing civilization had survived got the better of us, but I could tell she didn't regret it. In fact, she pulled me straight in for another kiss. I only wish we'd been more reserved about our celebration. I had no way of knowing that somebody else had not just seen the same airplane overhead, but heard us cheering wildly in the distance. Days 51 through 56. We had a new plan. Head south out of Los Angeles and follow the 5 freeway all the way to San Diego. It was a bit concerning because there were some important military installations there, but the fact that we saw a plane headed in that direction really lifted our spirits. Besides, the sad truth is we didn't have many options. It seemed like most of LA County had been obliterated in a nuclear strike, and the terrain around Los Angeles is not very hospitable. We could have headed north and tried to reach some of the smaller communities, but we figured that our best bet was to go somewhere the government would be invested in securing, and that meant San Diego. The way down the Hollywood Hills took us twice as long as the way up because the route was so unsafe, but at least we were able to raid the abandoned houses for supplies. We even found some new camping gear in one home and replaced some of our worn-out tents and sleeping bags. What was really holding us back was the fact that we had to carry everything we owned on our backs, so we were limited on what we could take and how fast we could move. Days 57 through 62. Getting to the 5 freeway was an ordeal in and of itself. We decided to head through Burbank to get to it and past Universal Studios and the Warner Brothers film lots. They were nothing but smoking debris now, since we were so close to the impact site near Bob Hope. But it was incredible to think that just over 2 months ago, these places were full of movie stars and thousands of people, all making hit movies that would be watched around the world. Our group had gotten close in the last few weeks, and Lucky was our de facto mascot. He really helped keep our spirits up. And with a goal in mind and the hope of seeing civilization again, the mood was generally positive, which is weird when you're passing by dozens of human remains every day. I could tell that Annie and Lilith were getting close, and that made me feel better because I was worried Lilith would think I had stolen Alexis away from her. Day 63. On day 63, Annie warned me that she thought someone was following us. She'd taken to scouting around us as we traveled. Sometimes she'd be out ahead, sometimes to one of our flanks, other times far behind us, catching up a few hours later. It was when she'd been lingering behind that she caught sight of a small plume of smoke a few miles behind us as we set up camp for the night. She spotted it 3 nights in a row, so she didn't think it was a coincidence. Then again, the 5 freeway would be the obvious choice for anyone traveling to safety in San Diego, so I wasn't convinced it was a threat. Besides, we hadn't run into any more fresh victims from whoever was out there killing people. She reluctantly agreed, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. I wish I'd listened to her. Days 64 through 68. We were finally outside of LA County, and here the destruction lightened up. We caught sight of 2 more planes, and that sent an electric shock of excitement through the group. The US had survived after all. Travel was faster outside of the main blast zones, but it seems as if multiple warheads had leveled not just most of LA County, but the surrounding cities as well. That makes sense. SoCal is obviously one of the most economically important parts of the US, especially Los Angeles, so it's obvious an enemy would try to destroy as much of it as possible. We picked up some bicycles from a mostly intact sporting goods store and managed to use them to carry more supplies, which made life a lot easier. Lucky had a blast keeping up with the bikes, and we had to ride slowly most of the time anyway because of all the debris, but we were making good time. By my count, we can make San Diego in a week or two at most at this rate. Day 69. Somebody took Lilith shortly after we set up camp for the night. She excused herself to use the bathroom, and we heard a brief struggle in the distance and then nothing. We immediately set out, but we couldn't find her. Annie picked up a trail, though, of what she thought was at least 3 people, with a 4th being dragged. Her old hunting skills really came into play as she immediately set out to track Lilith's kidnappers, but I had to stop her because my own military skills warned me against rushing straight into what could be an ambush. Annie and Alexis were both adamant that we set out right away, but I calmed them down by pointing out the fact that whoever took Lilith wanted her dead. They would have just attacked our camp. Finally, they agreed, so we waited until it got really dark, then followed the trail. I followed the group from the left flank, though, at a distance so I could remain unseen with my rifle. Turns out, though, that whoever took her had horses. How they managed to survive through the attack and fallout, I'll never know. But there were clear signs of where the horses had been tied up and then the tracks that led north into the wreckage of the city. Now I felt stupid because my insistence that we wait until it was fully dark had cost us an hour of pursuit time. Maybe we could have gotten to them before they got to their horses. At least we had tracks to follow. Day 70 and 71. It took us a day and a half of following the tracks to finally catch up with the kidnappers. They had holed themselves up in a surviving strip mall in the city of industry right outside LA. I guess they didn't expect us to follow for so long and so far because it didn't look like they were expecting visitors. Now we just had to hope that Lilith was alive. Annie and I were the best qualified for a rescue mission, so we waited until nightfall again and snuck up to the edge of their little compound. You could tell they were starting to secure the area because there were makeshift barricades in the middle of being constructed. But there were no guards posted. Instead, we heard laughing and some screaming coming from one of the buildings. Then suddenly the screaming cut off into a choking gurgle. With growing pits in our stomachs, we snuck over to the building where all the sound was coming from. Peering in through a broken window, we spotted a group of 5 all huddled around a fire, with a 6th figure chopping something up. To our horror, we realized what he was chopping. A person. That must have been who had screamed before being butchered. With a sigh of relief, though, we spotted Lilith chained up against a far wall. Whoever was being butchered, we guessed, about to be cooked. At least it wasn't her. Annie and I came up with a plan. We were both pretty good shots and angry as hell, so we waited until this crew of 6 settled into their disgusting meal and then split up. She attacked from one side while I attacked from the other, catching them between us. Annie opened fire first, shooting one of the cannibals in the chest, and then I started unloading. We dropped 3 instantly, with the 3rd reaching for a pistol and taking a shot in my direction. Annie got him clean between the eyes as I ducked for cover, then finished off one of the 2 survivors who took off running. I immediately gave chase for the surviving runner. I didn't want any part of this evil troop to survive and prey on other innocents. Annie, meanwhile, went to rescue Lilith, in case there were more around somewhere. The survivor turned a corner a few dozen feet ahead of me, and then I heard 2 gunshots almost simultaneously, followed by a scream I recognized as Alexis. Turning the corner, I found the surviving runner laying on the ground, clutching his leg. Across from him lay Ben, dead from a gunshot to the chest. Ben had come to try to help when he heard gunfire, and when the 2 ran into each other, the cannibal had been the better shot. With a roar of rage, I turned my gun on the survivor and pulled the trigger. Days 72 through 76. If there were other cannibals around, they didn't bother to give chase after the rescue. We didn't bury Ben either, because of fear of contaminated soil. But we covered him with rocks and a makeshift cairn like our ancestors used to. Annie was inconsolable, but having Lilith back helped. Our world had become cruel and deadly faster than any of us could imagine. Days 77 through 82. The road to San Diego was harder than we expected. The freeway had been packed when the bombs fell, so there were a lot of vehicles getting blown around by the superheated hurricane winds. We spotted another group of travelers in the distance heading north, and Alexis wanted to make contact with them. However, both Annie and I put our foot down and absolutely refused. We weren't taking any more risks. Days 83 through 89. The freeway was now running near the beach, and the sound of the ocean was almost comforting. Or it would have been if the beaches below us weren't covered in debris that had been washed out to sea and then right back on the waves. As far as the eye could see, the beaches were covered in the debris of an entire coastal city, destroyed in nuclear hellfire. Back in LA, the skies were perpetually covered in black, sooty clouds. Out here, the ocean winds created gaps in the clouds, but most of the time, all we had over our heads was thick, brownish clouds. We all knew that trillions upon trillions of pounds of debris had been blown up into the sky in the attacks, but could there really be so much that it covered the entire sky in dust and debris? As we neared San Diego, I was getting more and more nervous. Day 90. We spotted another airplane overhead, this time unmistakably a fighter jet. It came in from the ocean and seemed to head in the direction of San Diego before coming up north in our direction and curving back out to sea. Looking through a set of powerful binoculars we'd looted, Lilith swore that she could vaguely see the outline of an aircraft carrier out there in the horizon. We had to take her word for it. She had the sharpest vision of us all. She'd quickly taken to learning how to shoot the 2 rifles we'd brought with us and was proving to be a crack shot. Lilith was determined to never be helpless again. Days 91 through 96. Progress slowed down again due to debris and the fact that we got caught up in a severe storm. This is rare because SoCal almost never has bad storms in the summertime. We noticed that the temperature had been dropping slowly over the last 3 months as well, despite it being the middle of July. We thought about setting out rain catches to help replenish our water supplies, but I thought better of it once I saw how greasy the rain was as it fell. My fears that the skies above were still polluted with debris from the bombs proved true. The rain had come down hard for 2 full days, and when it finally cleared, there was no sunshine, just big puddles of sick-smelling water left behind. Luckily, we could still find plenty of convenience stores left abandoned, with shelves full of drinking water. Days 97 through 99. Something wasn't right. The lights from San Diego should have been visible at night for the last 2 days, despite the heavy cloud cover. Alexis figured it could have been the EMP blast from the attacks on Los Angeles. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling at the bottom of my stomach. Even Lucky felt it too. His normally happy self was looking increasingly worried, probably from picking up on the group's stress. Day 100. There was no denying it. San Diego had been hit by a nuclear attack alongside Los Angeles. That explained the lack of lights or traffic coming from the city. We finally traveled close enough to see it for ourselves. The skeletal remains of the iconic San Diego skyline far in the distance. The group was too crushed to do anything but set up camp early. If there was no safety in San Diego, then where could we go? Just how far had the war spread? That night we got our answer. Far out at sea, somewhere in the direction that Lilith swore she'd seen the outline of an aircraft carrier, came a blinding white flash, followed by a dull roar a minute after. I knew what I'd just seen, but it took me a while to pull myself together to explain it to the group. Whoever had attacked the United States with nuclear weapons had just struck again, this time destroying a carrier battle group just off the coast of Southern California. LA hadn't been the victim of a single attack, and nuclear war hadn't destroyed the entire world. Nuclear war was destroying the world because it was still being waged. A half hour after the explosion at sea, 3 plumes of fire from somewhere deep inside the United States lit up the night sky briefly before disappearing into space. Nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles from fields in the American heartland to strike back at whoever just hit us again. The war was clearly ongoing. While everyone had expected World War III to be over in an hour, we were dragging it out over weeks and even months, hitting tit for tat as one major city after another got wiped off the map. How far had it gone? Where would it stop? What was even left? Now go check out This Is How You Actually Survive a Nuclear Attack, or click this other video instead. Day 101. Nuclear war had devastated the west coast of America. Los Angeles and San Diego were gone, wiped off the map by multiple impacts by either Russian or Chinese nuclear weapons. Off the coast of San Diego, an entire carrier strike group, probably the only one left in the entire Pacific, was wiped out a day ago by another nuclear strike. That's how we found out the war wasn't over. It was still going on. Our group was down to me, Alexis, Lilith, Annie, and our loyal dog companion, Lucky. In just 100 days, we'd have lost so many already, and it seemed impossible to believe that just 3 months ago, I was living a normal life in a normal modern city. Now I was trying to figure out how to rally the group's spirits. We'd seen the dangers of giving up already. That's how we lost Mr. Vasquez, shortly after the bombs fell. San Diego was not an option for us. The ruins would be still too irradiated, and besides, it suffered from the same problem as any SoCal city. No real natural resources. SoCal gets most of its water from elsewhere, but that intricate system of aqueducts and pumps largely requires electricity and maintenance to function. We had to get somewhere we could survive long term, or at least last long enough to make a real plan. Our best option was Big Bear, a small mountain community in the mountains outside Los Angeles. It has a large lake for fresh water that's well stocked with fish, and the local mountains are teeming with wildlife. Back in the old world, it was a getaway for Angelinos. Now it was our best chance at survival. With vehicles no longer working due to bad fuel and the EMP blasts, we'd be on foot, using our bikes when we could, and it wouldn't be a short journey. Plus, we already knew of at least one dangerous cannibal community in Los Angeles outskirts, and there was no telling what else was waiting for us out here. With heavy hearts, we turned around and went back the way we came. Days 102 to 106. It was good to be on the move again. It helped get everyone's minds off the crushing disappointment of finding out the world was waging a nuclear war. During our rest breaks, Lilith took to practicing with the rifles we looted. After being abducted by the cannibals, she was determined to never be that vulnerable again, and thanks to me and Annie's coaching, she was becoming pretty proficient. Deep down inside, something told me she'd need those skills. At night, we'd see the occasional moving bright spot of light, which could only be a high-flying military plane. There were no more commercial airliners in the sky, and I wondered if that was only in this part of the country or everywhere. The way I figured, us and whoever we were at war with were striking each other's cities one by one in the most destructive game of one-upsmanship in history. It makes sense the West Coast got taken out first, and I was willing to bet the story was the same on the East Coast. America's most important government and financial centers were all on the coasts. The heartland was probably relatively untouched, and I imagine that the enemy, whoever they were, was slowly bombing its way inward from the coast until one side admitted defeat. We were probably doing the same to them. Day 107. We spotted him long before he saw us, a distant figure coming down the highway toward us. Through Annie's binoculars, he looked as if he might be in his late teens or early 20s. Definitely looked worse for the wear, unarmed and carrying only a backpack. Lilith immediately wanted to hide and let him pass by us, sparking a fierce debate. I can't blame her for not trusting strangers after almost being eaten alive by cannibals, but Alexis refused to let this world change us the way it did those cannibals. If civilization was going to survive, it needed good people to stand up for what was right. Besides, he was alone and unarmed. She made a convincing point. Annie and I went ahead of the group, while Lucky, Alexis, and Lilith stayed behind. Lilith covered us with a rifle. She'd become a good enough shot that if this kid tried anything, I was confident she'd put him in the dirt. The kid didn't seem surprised to see us, but he was definitely a little bit apprehensive. He said his family got killed by raiders 2 months after the bombs, and he'd been walking south to San Diego, hoping that at least the military base there had survived. We broke the bad news, and his shoulders slumped. He had nowhere to go, and I couldn't just let him walk off alone. Besides, the bigger our group, the stronger we would be, so I offered to join us. With a big smile, he happily agreed and introduced himself as Robbie. That night at camp, I noticed Lilith was keeping a close eye on Robbie. She'd changed since her ordeal. She used to be lighter. Now she was serious most of the time. It scared me a little. Having Annie helped, and for her part, Annie barely budged from Lilith's side. Losing her brother Ben had been a huge blow, but having Lilith near really helped. I couldn't help but wonder if Lilith felt guilty considering Ben had died trying to rescue her. But I pushed those thoughts out of my mind and instead let my focus be on the positive. Lilith and Annie weren't the only ones to find love in the apocalypse, and I snuggled in to sleep next to Alexis, waiting to get woken up for my turn to take watch. Days 108 to 112. When we told Ben our plan to get to Big Bear, he agreed wholeheartedly, and even suggested that we take the desert roads instead of the 5 freeway to cut down on travel time. Plus, it'd be less likely we'd run into cannibals or raiders on the move in remote roads. That was a good idea, so we left the 5 behind and headed east into the desert. Luckily, there are still desert communities out here, and gas stations popped up regular enough that we could top up on supplies as needed. Some of them had been scavenged pretty hard already, but we had plenty of supplies to make it to Big Bear even if we didn't find anything on the way. For the millionth time since the bombs fell, I found myself shaking my head. 4 months ago, my biggest concern was Diablo Immortal being a microtransaction hell. Now, I was in literal hell, and my biggest concerns were radiation poisoning, cannibals, and dehydration. Days 113 to 117. Despite relatively open roads and our bikes, we weren't making very good time. The heat during the day was oppressive, so we traveled at night, but it was still hot enough to sweat. Besides, we didn't have a bike for Robbie and had yet to find one, so we were forced to move at his pace. We were getting near the Salton Sea. I knew it because you could literally smell it. If there was anywhere in the world that resembled a nuclear apocalypse before the bombs fell, this was it. Once had been a vibrant resort community after the Colorado River flooded over irrigation canals in 1905 and poured into the Salton Basin. Humans did what humans do best and took advantage of the impromptu giant lake as a vacation spot. A sprawling resort community sprung up along the banks of the sea, and it was a popular getaway destination for decades. But soon, the only water flowing into the sea was agricultural runoff, which made the sea 50% saltier than the ocean. The wildlife began to die off, and massive blooms of algae poisoned the water. People left the once thriving community around the sea, letting the desert retake the land and leaving homes, hotels, and shops completely abandoned. Now the sea was so overrun with toxic algae and dead fish that it stunk for miles around. It was an ecological